Thank you. I think this was a good concluding remark for our panel, and we now look to Christine for the concluding remarks for our conference. Christine, you have the floor, if I may.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Andreas, also for excellent timekeeping. So I don't want to keep you much longer either. So my name is Christina Schwilbe-Patel, and I'm a reader at Warwick Law School, and I'm currently based at the Humboldt University in Berlin with a fellowship for experienced researchers where I'm working on international law and the green transition. And I want to thank SHRA and particularly Pratyush and Emmerich for the kind invitation. A conference on climate justice with so many voices from the Global South is timely and necessary. I'll try to take into consideration all, or at least most of the fantastic contributions that I've had the privilege of hearing in the past 2 days, 1.5 days, and please excuse any mispronunciation of names. I'll begin by saying something about the context, and then I'll say a few words about climate injustice, and then finally about climate justice. So by and large, I think we can all agree that we've moved on from climate change denialism. In a sense, climate change denialism was for a time a privilege of the West. As we heard in many papers yesterday, in particular in the Global South, climate change has been experienced firsthand as causing floods, droughts, storms, destruction of marine and inland habitats and ecosystems. Moreover, places with indigenous populations, although not perhaps strictly in the Global South, so I'm thinking here, for example, of Greenland, are experiencing melting glaciers affecting rising sea levels globally. The consequences of their carbon irresponsibility is now coming back to the global North states too. It's a climate boomerang, if you want. Although there are notable exceptions, there is a general recognition that climate change is already happening that is necessary to change the way that humans interact with nature. Today, it is then what Westerners like to do, exert their privilege in particular ways. It's the privilege of those in the West to claim fatigue of climate change topics. For those in the Global South, this is an existential problem that cannot be tackled when it is convenient. So in the presentations, we gained a comprehensive overview that the problem of climate catastrophe needs to be addressed or mitigated at the international, regional, national, community, and individual levels. At the international level, efforts to address climate injustice have mostly been disappointing. As you all know, in November 2022, world leaders met in Egypt at the UN's annual forum on climate change. Much like the previous 26 rounds of negotiations, COP27 prompted few meaningful solutions to the world's climate emergency. Similarly, at the regional and national levels, efforts have largely been disappointing. In the Global North, a market solution for climate change is often framed as found in the green transition, which is in large part based on understanding solutions to climate change and switching to electric vehicles, and is championed by billionaires such as Elon Musk and Bill Gates. Then on the national level, just want to highlight here the US Inflation Reduction Act of 2022, which was considered as a breakthrough in terms of climate policies, provided tax incentives to companies and consumers to buy electric vehicles and other environmental products. And recently, very recently, the EU has introduced an equivalent mechanisms on securing critical raw materials for the green transition. So from a Global South perspective, I can imagine that this preoccupation with electric vehicles can appear almost comical. In any event, I believe we all share the question on why it is that political and legal responses have been so disappointing. Why is it that the status quo is favored over radical change? One response offered by Swahila Praveen is that such long-term challenges don't mesh well with a 4-year electoral cycle, the 2 to 3 terms of ministers and top officials, or daily or weekly rhythms of ordinary politics. So I think it is important here to acknowledge that that is certainly true, but also to acknowledge that there are systemic powers at play, while also being able to acknowledge complicity of individual politicians and ourselves. So I believe that an analysis of political economy is particularly useful here. So what does that mean? It means to ask who benefits, not so much from who benefits from climate emergency, although there certainly are those who benefit from that too, but who benefits from climate injustice and from framing climate justice in particular in a very particular fashion, namely an economic, individualized, and also legalized way. Okay, so let me say a little bit about climate injustice. Perhaps bouncing a little bit off that dichotomy introduced earlier through Andreas, this is the climate adaptation part. Okay, so Leha Praveen stated correctly that climate change is superimposed on existing vulnerabilities. So existing vulnerabilities, what does that mean? For a global problem, we need to think about how the vulnerabilities to, say, weather events came about. The extractive, legal, economic, racialized, gendered, cultural forms of oppression that are the context for vulnerabilities, and related to that, the limited number of possibilities of overcoming or addressing these vulnerabilities become important to understand. So mobility and immobility, I think, is a key aspect here. So as we heard yesterday from researchers who have engaged in fieldwork in particular, working with affected communities, these, the vast majority of those say moving away is not an option. And as we heard from Andrea Pelliconi earlier, if mobility is necessitated, then there are often legal repercussions or no legal protections, but indeed the people fleeing are often, or the people displaced are often themselves criminalized, the phenomenon of which is referred to as crimmigration. So this conference then has begged the question once again of the linkages between climate change, capitalism, and colonialism. So probably these linkages were most clearly brought out through papers by Rahul Yakuka, Ankita Oja, and the recording earlier from Pierre Spilevoy. So I just want to highlight a few levels on which these linkages, I think, operate. The first of those is propertization and commodification of nature, also referenced by Rahul. And here I was thinking in particular also of Adrian Buller's recent book, The Value of a Whale, which looks at how this commoditization exactly takes place through a sense of value, which is measured economically. Then another level at which this operates is that climate change disproportionately affects the global south. And that's the tourism. And here I was thinking in particular of Carmen Gonzalez's work on racial capitalism and climate change. These are all interrelated. Propertization, climate change affecting disproportionately the global south. And thirdly, then global value chains. Here I'm thinking in particular of the linkages between extraction and poverty, and how that leads to particular vulnerabilities. And then finally, yesterday we heard quite a few accounts on pollution, and often climate change is, and initially I was sort of thinking, I don't know whether that really fits into what we're talking about when we're talking about climate justice, but I've actually come to think that it is important to mention pollution. That can be a local issue, but also pollution that can be a global issue. And that theme was taken up by Ankita Ojha. And I was here thinking of Rob Nixon's Environmentalism of the Poor, in which he describes how recycling in the global north, as I'm sure you're aware, often ends up washed up on the beaches of the global south. Okay, so those are some of the levels then at which these linkages between climate change capitalism and colonialism work. So we can think of these as interlinked oppressions. Capitalism, if you want, quadruple subordination of women, the environment, the working class, and race. Others have aimed to capture this by describing our time as the Capitalocene. So Rishi Shri stated, climate justice has become another significant concept to shape the relationship between the developed and developing countries. So for understanding climate injustice, a greater understanding of colonial history and neo-colonial dependencies then is required. For example, one might look at the carbon-emitting industries, like agriculture. When and what crops did people start growing to meet the Western demand? Or one might look at transportation and energy. How did coal, then oil, and now the minerals for the green transition become the sources of energy to fuel the development of the West? And then we might look at industries of mass consumption. How are natural resources extracted, and companies in the global south prevented from moving further upstream on the global value chain? The mining industry's hysteria about Chile's new model to deal with its lithium extraction very recently, and plans to move down further that value chain, again, I think shows really well those interlinkages between climate change, capitalism, and colonialism. Okay, so that's the climate injustice. And then briefly on climate justice. So Patricia Hobbs asked the crucial question of what is justice? So what even are we talking about? Now, lawyers, of course, like to think that they have something quite significant to say when it comes to justice. But it's not predominantly a lawyer's game, of course. And Emmerich said yesterday, law is not enough. But let's think about other areas. In which ways do law and the economy come together? Here, I think is important to understand. So climate catastrophe in terms of climate mitigation is mostly framed as a problem for the economy and for law. Coming back to what I started off with, one that can be addressed through electric vehicles, carbon captures, legislation that incentivizes investment, and so on. Here, climate justice is a market problem. When it comes to the role of governance, I think there is a pretty developed critical view when it comes to top-down approaches. So it's pretty widely accepted that a top-down approach is unlikely to yield results that are fair. A bottom-up approach, I would say, is communitarian, and there's really important work being done on that. There might also be room, although I'm more skeptical of that, for the viewpoint that was presented by Ruchika Gupta and Aparna Sharma, that it operates at a level of, at an individual level, including of self-improvement. So let's think about the role of law then. Justice is often seen somehow as the same as law. Lawyers like to speak a lot about justice. And this is maybe why when it comes to climate justice, the role of law is much more ambivalent, because I think there is space for saying what the law does in terms of climate emergency is pretty bad. But let's think about the ways in which lawyers tend to frame this and sort of the familiar responses from law. So that there might be calls for new laws, like Girassi Mamadou. But what if existing laws will inhibit effectiveness of any new laws? And then coming to the discussion from yesterday, what if the cultural acceptance of laws is tainted by the way in which laws were historically forms of oppression for communities rather than forms of emancipation? So another role for law is new interpretations of old laws, and in a way that is something that Andrea Pelliconi was calling for in her rethinking of refugee law. Then there might be calls for implementation of existing laws. And in a way, although he's also ambivalent about that, Andreas proposed this, as did Giulia Lovati in her paper, pointing to ways in which the law could serve as a catalyst then to incorporate other objectives. And then there's another role for law, which we heard about in this last session, on climate litigation, to make states or corporations responsible for climate change or destruction of the environment. And we heard that by Emmerich again, Mariko Watanabe, and Patricia. But what if climate litigation and reform and its attention to technical legal problems kicks the immediate issue of climate change into the long grass and depoliticizes it? So the question, the broader question that is hidden in that is, what does that do to the political possibilities that are presented through a bottom-up approach? When people think, okay, these issues are being fought out in the courts, it could have an inherently depoliticizing effect, as well as creating lots of opportunities for lawyers, because lawyers are then suddenly there to understand what the loopholes are, or if there are certain blockages to capital flows through one legislation, how that can be unblocked through other policies and so on. So who benefits? Again, coming back to that question on political economy, who benefits? I'm not sure that those who are affected by climate justice, injustice, that they benefit from these approaches to law. So if we deal in law and we refer to different legal instruments, I think we have an obligation to also show which laws, in particular trade laws, investment law, licenses, continue to support corporate and state sanctioned exploitation of the environment. So what do we expect then of climate justice? Pratyush said yesterday, it becomes an insult to injury to think of the global south as doing something about climate injustice. And I think I'll continue to think about that for a long time, Pratyush. But at the same time, we in the West as I think Pierre Spilavoy also rightly said, must learn from community and indigenous practices of living with nature. So there has to be some kind of dialogue. Could this dialogue be international solidarity, as also suggested by Pratyush? Ruchi Shri calls instead for a renewed idea of the commons. There's also been this proposal on thinking of legal perspectives of an ecocentric view, with a special interest of nature and so on. Or, as in some of the discussions yesterday, is what is required a deference to local custom? Swaleha Praveen, again, I think rightly, calls for building coalitions and new institutions. And this requires also, as Ankita Ojha showed yesterday, I think really well, that we need to study movements like the ecofeminist movements of the Chipko movement, which I found really interesting to find out about. So for justice to be intersectional, I believe we need to return to the understanding of climate injustice, drawing on those theorists of imperialism and search for their ecology. So this is my call to action. In this, I join Pratyush in saying that the origins of harm are crucially important to understanding how solidarity can play out today. And here I think it's redistribution is important in the form of reparations for harm caused. Kohei Saito has offered a rereading of Marx in Capital in the Anthropocene. Ankit Bajaj has recently published on W.B. Du Bois's environmental racialization theories, and Rosa Luxemburg combined an understanding of capitalism and its racializing element with her views on nature. Often the latter has been presented in a romanticized form. So political economy is seen as seen as the real deal, while anything that then connects it to ecology and nature is seen as the romantic version of that, or an aside. And certainly Rosa Luxemburg, I think, has been misunderstood in that form. But I want to say that those two belong together in understanding not just those theories, but also how those people lived their lives and what movements they engaged in. So we need to learn to move away from the more romanticized view of nature to a sober idea of democracy from below and faith in the masses without losing the utopian vision. And here I perhaps differ than from Pratyush's view, in that I think a utopian vision is necessary and feasible, of a more equal world in which neither people nor nature are exploited. So thanks very much for giving me the opportunity to reflect on these points, and thank you all for your incredibly instructive papers and discussions.
Thank you so much for having agreed to give your concluding remarks. Thank you. Hello, am I audible?
Yeah, you are.
Yes, you are.
Thank you so much for having agreed. And so you summarized all the presentations so succinctly and, very precisely, and also added your own reflections to it. Thank you so much, Professor.
Yeah, thank you very much also from my side. So this wraps up